Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24, 2022, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters Intopia and Fable, and Gold supporters Barrier Break, TPGI, and UX for the Win. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have questions for the presenters, and we hope you do, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag or post them in the YouTube chat, and we will come around and sweep those up for a Q&A at the end of the session. I'm pleasantly surprised to see that Lee Dale has returned to be our guest host. Lee, over to you.
Thanks again. Really appreciate it and happy to be here. We're very lucky to have Scott Vinkel by way of Shopify sharing an exclusive design workflow for teams. So go ahead, Scott.
Nice. I like that exclusive. That sounds a lot better than my title. Yeah, thanks, Lee. Thanks, Adrian. Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Vinkel, accessibility specialist at Shopify. And today I'll be sharing a few tips on how I integrated accessibility into a new team workflow. But in order to understand how this all came about, we need to take a step back a little bit in time. So this is a photo of me taken back in late 2017 in one of the Shopify offices. This is back when they had offices. This was my first day back at Shopify when I returned as its first in-house accessibility consultant. So from this point in time to around 2020 or so, I was working mostly reactively. So Shopify is a fast-moving company, frequently shipping new features. There was a constant feeling of playing catch-up when a new release took place. So perhaps you could relate. So working reactively means that I was conducting long, thorough accessibility audits on existing products, reviewing products after receiving launch emails, jumping into Slack conversations and asking if accessibility was considered in recent releases, and constantly changing teams, leads, and basically putting out the latest fire in an attempt to have some sort of stable environment. So fast forward to 2020, I jumped teams yet again and start working with a new lead. This time it's with our flagship themes team. So this was a newly formed team that was responsible for creating our free themes in our theme store. Now, each time I move to a new team or work with a new lead, I go through the exercise of explaining what I do at Shopify, why I do what I do, and how I work. So the good thing about re-explaining myself is that I'm able to share the message of accessibility with someone one-on-one. We go through the motions of understanding how to work with me, why accessibility is important, and how this work will actually make our products better in the long run. What was not so good at the time was that my focus was split around the organization. So I was trying hard to scale accessibility more broadly and was not completely focused on the task at hand. So after having a few one-on-one sessions with my new lead, she openly expressed some concern. She said, Scott, you know what, you need to slow down. You need to start saying no to tasks unrelated to this team and this project. And I'm worried about your health. And she had a valid point. You see, up until this point, I've been saying yes to pretty much any opportunity to help with accessibility around Shopify. It didn't matter what the project was or the team that was behind the work. I just wanted to help. But the problem was I'd stretched myself too thin, made too many promises, and worked on too many things at once. And it really did take a toll on my mental health. So I took my lead's advice and I started saying no. It wasn't easy, but what this exercise led to was greater focus. Focus on the primary task, which was to make sure our free themes were shipped highly accessible by default. So with this newfound focus, I decided to try something new, something that I'd heard of or others around the industry share many times over. And that was implementing the concept of shift left. So in case you're unaware, shift left is the idea of incorporating accessibility best practices much earlier in the project lifecycle. So it includes more voices and perspectives in the ideation, prototype, and design phases of production creation. More testing with assistive technologies by people with disabilities. So by the time the project ships, it should be done with confidence that there are very few accessibility defects. And since accessibility is really about the human experience, it makes sense to include all of this in a project. So it's people who will be using your product after all. So how do I approach including the idea of shift left into this team's existing workflow? So as a first iteration, there were basically three main outcomes that I had in mind when I started thinking about how to shift accessibility left while working with the flagship themes team. So one, integrate accessibility into code review. Two, integrate accessibility into design review. And three, I wanted to work closely with the project leadership in order to place accessibility on the team roadmap. So each of these in a little more detail. So code review is already core to our workflow. At Shopify, developers will review each other's code changes for code quality. They'll also pull down the development branch in order to test to make sure that things are working as expected. So one of the aspects I wanted to make known to the developers of this team was that I was also available for code review, specifically reviewing code for accessibility best practices in markup and pulling down branches in order to manually test with assistive technology. So moving more left, one of the main aspects in shifting left is incorporating a design review. So the idea here is by reviewing a design with an inclusive lens, you should be able to catch quite a few visual accessibility defects before the design moves to implementation. Design reviews also will include annotations. So that is leaving notes for developers to follow during implementation. Moving even further left now, the last aspect I was thinking about at the time was working more closely with project leadership. So accessibility really needs to be represented in the project plan in order to be successful in creating and shipping a highly accessible user experience by default. Team members really need to know that leadership supports and encourages inclusive design and development practices. So I figured with this small scale of one team working towards the same goal, if I could get support from the top, that would definitely help to make sure everyone was on the same page. And so the good news was that my new lead was also one of the project leads of Flagship Themes. So right away, I had a good working relationship with the leadership team, and they understood my position on the team and what I wanted to accomplish while on the project. Okay, so let's dive right into the workflow details. So I went about forming this workflow and communicating my plan of action in more or less 3 steps. So one, I wrote documentation detailing the steps on how I'd work with the designers and developers of the team. 2, I set up separate meetings with each group, designers and developers. And 3, I played a proactive role on the team and made myself available to work closely with everyone and to answer any questions. Coming back to this idea of focus. So I started by writing 2 documents. One outlining the intended workflow with the designers and another outlining the workflow with developers. So I included detailed steps along the way, clearly communicating how the designer or developer and the accessibility specialist would work together. I also added some immediate action items. So items such as using the Stark Figma plugin to check color contrast or to install the VS Code Axe accessibility linter to catch issues as code was written. Yeah, so let's dig into some of the details that I shared with each group. So to start off, all of Shopify's design work is done using Figma. So I knew that if I wanted to start conducting design reviews, I'd better get more acquainted and more familiar with Figma. So my experience with that tool up until this point was zilch. I'd never used it before, but I wanted to familiarize myself enough to be able to speak with our designers when introducing the new workflow. And for a long time, I was aware that there were design annotation kits available for Figma, but I never actually took the time to really explore what they had to offer until this point. So I reviewed a few, but I ended up adopting the A11Y annotation kit from Indeed. This one seemed to have a lot of what I was looking for in terms of clarity and labeling options, and it was easy to use. So after getting a little more comfortable using Figma and the annotation kit, I got to work on writing my plan. So at the top of my document, I shared an executive summary of the purpose of the workflow. So I stated the purpose of this document is to outline how UX designers and accessibility specialists may work collaboratively. The outcome is to, 1, ensure visual design accessibility best practices have been reviewed and implemented, and 2, produce an accessibility specification which outlines assistive technology requirements/expectations, both of which will aid in creating accessible and usable products by people with disabilities, increasing Shopify's reach into the global market. And here's what I shared in terms of the actual workflow. So 1, before the designer hands off their final design to the developer, the designer will notify the accessibility specialist for review. And this can be accomplished by 2 ways. 1, pinging the accessibility specialist in Figma, or sharing a link to the Figma file in Slack. Point number 2, the accessibility specialist will review the design with a strict inclusive design lens. So the purpose of this is to check for visual accessibility best practices, such as color contrast, focus indicators, focused order, etc. The review will include annotations and notes for developers on recommended HTML elements, attributes, keyboard support, etc. And in 3, the accessibility specialist will inform the designer of the completed review. At this point, the designer will make sure the Figma file is ready for developer handoff. And then go on to say any required changes from the code review or usability testing will be reflected in the accessibility specification. And this is to be our single source of truth. So essentially, before the workflow was implemented, designers on the team would share their finalized designs directly with the developers for implementation. Nothing really out of the ordinary there. But this new workflow inserted a point in between this handoff activity. So instead of moving directly to the developer, the designer would hand off to me first. At that point, I'd open the design file and review for visual accessibility best practices, and as well as include annotations for the developer to implement. So this would become essentially our accessibility specification for developers to review and implement accordingly. And moving over to the developer workflow, I created a second document outlining the details. So this is what I share with them. So point number 1, the designer will hand off the Figma design over to the developer for implementation. So at this point, the developers should review the design and accessibility specification. If there are any questions, the developer will meet with the designer or accessibility specialist before implementation. 2, developer to implement accessibility specification as noted in Figma. Review the annotations and notes found under the A11Y annotations Figma frame. Incorporate each annotation into your code. 3, developer to ping accessibility specialist for PR review. And this can be accomplished by either tagging the accessibility specialist in the PR or sharing the link to the PR in Slack. And then finally, point number 4, the accessibility specialist will sign off on the PR before merge. And the specialist will review the code and test using assistive technology. If deemed necessary, depending on the complexity of the component, the specialist will also set up usability sessions for additional feedback, all of which will be completed before code merge. And then I go on to say, if this is not possible due to critical or time-sensitive change, merge as needed. The specialist will review changes in production. So again, similar idea here that before the workflow was implemented, the design team would share their finalized design with the developers for implementation, and then they would just implement the code accordingly. But this new workflow inserted a point where before writing code, the developer would have the specification to follow. And before shipping the code, the UI would be thoroughly tested with assistive technology. Essentially, the workflow can be summarized in this very much oversimplification of Instead of the designer handing off to the director, to the developer, the designer would instead hand off to the accessibility specialist, who would then hand off to the developer. And the two main points here to note is before designing, handoff, review for visual accessibility best practices. And then 2, implement the accessibility specification before merge. So with these 2 documents written, I set up 2 meetings, one with the designers and another with the developer team. And the purpose of which was to directly communicate my intent on how we'd all work together on implementing this new workflow. And suffice it to say, honestly, the meetings went really well. After I went through the documentation in full, folks on the team were quite receptive. They understood the ask and were quite eager to start. So it was really great. And I was very thankful to be working with folks who wanted to learn more in this area. So with the plan set and the team on board, I set off to begin this new process. So how did it go? How did things actually work in practice? Well, at first, things went quite well. Designers were pinging me for review. I was able to add my notes and annotations in Figma, and devs were taking the spec and implementing accordingly. It was really great. So as an example here, I recall the very first component we all worked on together was one of the more complicated patterns on the web, everyone's favorite, the carousel. As expected, the designer pinged me when they were done designing with the carousel, and I went in and annotated and left some notes, and actually used the APG carousel pattern as my starting point. So when I was finished here, I let the developer know the accessibility spec was ready for implementation. And I do recall that the component work had begun slightly before this point. So the developer needed to make some slight markup changes and they needed to add a sprinkling of ARIA here and there. And since this component was so complex, I promptly set up usability test sessions as soon as the developer had made the spec adjustments to their pull request. And I believe it was due to starting with the APG carousel pattern, the usability sessions went quite well. Testers were able to recognize the component as a carousel, and I was able to gather valuable feedback on how the user experience could be improved. I then shared this feedback with the developer and also made sure to update the spec in the Figma file. And that's an important thing to note, is that we want to always keep the spec up to date with the latest information. People need to have confidence and to trust the source. So finally, when it came to ship this component, I felt it was in a really good place, and we were confident when it landed in production. But after a while, perhaps a month or 2, I started receiving less requests to review component designs. It made me a little nervous, and I started questioning myself. So I started asking things like, did I not clearly articulate why this was important, or how the workflow was intended to go? So in order to keep momentum going, I decided to be proactive and reach out to the designers on the team to see if their designs were ready for review. I also sent a friendly reminder to the team in our Slack channel just to ping me for review when anything was ready. So most of the time when I asked directly, it was just that the design wasn't ready for review. They were still working things out, and that was totally fine. I was able to work on other tasks while new designs were being finalized. But one thing I think is important to note, it's something that I realized shortly after, was that as new teammates come on board, it's important to have those one-on-ones to introduce yourself, the work you do, and how you intend to work together. In this way, folks will gain a basic understanding of why accessibility is important and will be aware of the expectations when working together. Now, one question that I imagine is on folks' minds here is, did this increase time to ship? Did working in this way prolong the team's ability to ship new features on time? So the answer is, yeah. Adding something new to an existing process will increase time to output. It's like learning anything new. Acquiring the experience and mindfulness to incorporate inclusive design into any discipline, it will take time. However, eventually this will be commonplace. Designers and developers won't need to put in extra time or effort for inclusive accommodations. It'll just be part of their workflow. Inclusive design will become part of their regular thinking on how to tackle a problem. So the challenge we face right now is getting folks to that point. People need to understand the problem, why it exists, all of this before the solution is implemented organically. But coming back to my experience with this workflow, accessibility changes and reviews didn't really hold back the team that much. Because of the nature of how this team operated, designers, developers, and even project leads, they all worked together in providing input on any component. I was able to complete my code reviews, my AT testing, and usability testing, all before the team was even finished discussing the finer points like spacing or rounded corners or aspects which didn't really affect usability necessarily. So one of the things I called out earlier, and something that I've been doing more of recently, is working closely with leadership. So this includes team leads, project leads, managers, directors, VPs, and even C-level executives. And over the years, I've realized that in order to avoid working reactively and to be successful in shifting accessibility left, working with and regularly sharing context with leadership is key. So something I've been doing as of late to help leadership understand the accessibility of a product at the time is to gather quantifiable accessibility data. So this data helps answer the question, how are we doing in terms of accessibility? So this data can also be used as metrics to benchmark and measure accessibility changes and effort over time. So there are two methods that I've been using to gather this data. One, using automated accessibility testing, and two, usability testing results resulting in overall usability score. So I'll go into these details here. So this first method is fairly straightforward. There are many automated test suites available. I personally prefer to use Axe DevTools to gather data, as it includes a fairly comprehensive suite of tests, which are measurable. But whichever test suite you use, it's up to you. So for every unique page in the project, I'll run Axe and take note of the URL of the page, the total number of defects found on the page, the total number of WCAG level A issues, and the total number of WCAG level AA issues on the page. So I store this data in a spreadsheet in order to share with leadership. I also color code each cell based on the values in order to help reviewers better understand what the data means, the severity of the amount of defects found. So I use the following threshold designations to determine the colors used. So less than 10 defects will be green, 10 to 50 defects will be a yellow, and greater than 50 defects will mean a red background. So along with this data, I also make sure to share the caveat that automated testing results are not comprehensive, that manual testing is also important in understanding the accessibility of a product. So this is why I also include usability test results with my data set. But the advantage of using automated testing is that it's fast and relatively inexpensive. You can get this data over to your leadership team with relative ease. So when it comes to usability testing, Shopify's preferred testing platform is Fable. So Fable has a method to measure the accessibility of a product for assistive technology users in what's called the AUS. That stands for Accessibility Usability Scale. The AUS consists of 10-item questionnaire with 5 response options ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And the numerical score received is based on how these questions are answered. And this equates to your metric data. So in order to gather these metrics from usability testing, I set up multiple self-guided tasks, one for each assistive technology variant available. This is to ensure a wide range of AUS scores are in the result data for review. So when each session is completed, I'll review and take note of the device type, either desktop or mobile, the assistive technology in use, whether it was a screen reader or a switch device or Zoom, anything like that. I'll also download the session video to Google Drive and share the link for those who don't have access to Fable. And I'll also take note of the AUS score reported by the tester. So again, I'll store this data in a spreadsheet. I'll apply a similar color-coded cells based on the AUS value in order to help our viewers better understand the severity of the score. So I use the following threshold designations to determine the colors used. So an average score greater than 75 is green. A score between 50 and 75 would be yellow. And a score less than 50 is red. So with this data readily available, I have something tangible to share with leadership. I can share this information and start road mapping and prioritizing user flow accessibility efforts with project leads. So here's a few quick tips when reaching out to leadership to share your findings. I found this to be useful over the last few years as I started to reach out to leadership more closely. So when communicating with leadership, be clear and precise. So their time, as well as your own time, is extremely valuable. So state why you're reaching out to them in the first 1 to 2 sentences, then go into details with more information. So you want to think of this as a final conclusion if, say, you were to write an essay. So start this conclusion first and then go into more details. Have some links or data available to back up your claim. So if they're interested in learning more about what you're sharing, provide a method for them to easily consume this information on their time. So you want to insert links within your message with relevant details for each link. And then finally, if possible, provide details on how you yourself are solving the problem. So this shows that you're not looking for their help necessarily, but rather you're making an effort to address the issue yourself and are merely wanting to share context or acquire guidance from their expertise. And I really think that someone in a leadership role who cares deeply about the accessibility of their product will appreciate regular check-ins and updates. I think this will help with long-term planning and the sustainability of your accessibility program and growth in your organization. Okay, so project managers, I'm speaking to you now. So here's a few tips to help you include accessibility in project planning and road mapping. So as a project manager, you probably know your product space the best, probably out of everyone on the team. And it's during project planning that you should be defining the accessibility success criteria for your project and the milestones to achieve those requirements. So let's review some ways to define accessibility requirements, create accessibility OKRs, and to set up quarterly sprints. So when documenting your project success criteria, include the exercise of defining accessibility requirements. So start by being clear about your product type. So is it highly transactional? Is it mostly consumption like a news or blog? Or perhaps it's presentational or e-commerce. The product type will dictate where you start in terms of accessibility and which WCAG success criteria to include in the definition. So from this point, decide on 1 or 2 user journeys to prioritize accessibility efforts. So one such example is what I call the critical path. So the critical path is something that is most common user journey, which affects all users all the time. So this critical path, the idea, it answers the question, what's the most important task or set of tasks for a user to be successful in using our product? So for example, in e-commerce, excuse me, A critical path would be the user journey from storefront homepage to checkout. What are the minimal amount of steps needed to get from start to finish? And there are other user journeys the user could take, such as reading a blog post or logging into their account. But this journey in particular is critical to the success of your product, the baseline MVP, that is minimal viable product. So you want to repeat this exercise for other user journeys, which may be less common. So another exercise is to create accessibility OKRs. That stands for objectives and key results. So by creating sets of OKRs and setting them as part of your deliverables, you'll be setting the project up for success by measuring effectiveness of your efforts and by keeping track to meet your objectives. So here's just a few examples that I have here. Let's just say milestone number 1, objective. Test for and remove automated accessibility issues in product name. Key result, expect 0 errors with Axe DevTools. Milestone number 2, objective, product name, critical path to be fully keyboard accessible. Key results, expect product name core functionality to work with only a keyboard. Expect product name to feature highly visible focus states, etc. Milestone number 3, objective, product name to support screen reader accessibility. Key results, expect product name to support screen reader with browser on whichever operating system you're supporting. Another one here, expect usability testers to be 75% successful while using product name with a screen reader. So the idea is when these are defined, be sure to retest often and to make sure that no regressions leak through. I'd suggest retesting probably at least once a quarter, making these part of your quarterly deliverables. So one more tip here is to set up quarterly sprints. So sprints will be important if and when you need to retrofit an existing product with accessibility best practices. So a sprint is typically run each quarter for maybe 2 to 3 weeks. And the idea here is during a sprint, a handful of dedicated folks on the team would be available to thoroughly test, report, and address accessibility issues. And the key to a successful sprint, I found, isn't necessarily, how many issues are addressed and remediated, but rather to carve out the time to provide focus towards accessibility issues. Even if you close out 10 out of 100 issues, that's still really great progress in making your product even more accessible. So at the end of the sprint, I think it's important to report related data to the team and project leads to share this information. So for example, how many issues were fixed and how many remain as a percentage. Temperature check or remeasure product accessibility status via automated testing or perhaps unmoderated usability tests. And then verify if any milestone deliverables were met by reviewing your OKRs. So it's important for project leads to have access to this data in order to report updates to senior management. The idea is to keep everyone in the loop with accurate data points and context. So this workflow is definitely a work in progress. While it worked for this team, it may need to be adjusted for other scenarios. For example, if you are a specialist working with many teams and many projects, or if there's no specialist in your organization at all. So the point is that the workflow is meant to be flexible and to be adaptable to your needs. And like accessibility itself, this process and workflow is ever evolving. But what's important is that we, excuse me, what's important that we prioritize progress over perfection. Making small changes over time is a much healthier way to achieve sustainable accessibility. And eventually you'll end up with a process which makes accessibility inclusion the default. So after going through all this material, I realize perhaps some folks out there might be still asking the question, why shift accessibility left? Why implement this workflow at all? And how is this important to my business or my organization? So I actually have another talk called Why Accessibility. It goes more into making the business case for accessibility and the business benefits for incorporating accessibility program. But I thought I'd share my answer to this question here as well. So why shift left? Well, firstly, to build higher quality products. Accessibility is innovation. So we might not have things like curb cuts or electric toothbrushes, automatic doors, texting, or even the iPhone touchscreen if it weren't for disabled people with disabilities and disabled designers who helped create these things in the first place. To avoid costly lawsuits, tech debt, and sprints to retrofit. It costs so much more to implement accessibility after the fact, rather than being mindful and deliberate upfront during research, design, and development. To increase the value of your product and organization. So products which are built inclusively stand out against the competitors and increase profits. Social good, and to build customer loyalty. So organizations which create with inclusive design in mind will acquire a loyal customer base. I mean, for example, look at Apple. So many people swear by Apple products because they built accessibility into their products by default. And the final point here is to allow your fellow human beings to live independently and with dignity. I think that disability affects us all. It doesn't discriminate. It's not racist. It's not ageist. It's not really a matter of if, but when. So the idea here is, your future self will thank you for the work that you do today. And one final thought. I'll never forget when I received the launch email for when our own themes shipped for public consumption. After reading the email, I instinctively opened one of the themes in my browser and started this rudiment accessibility testing that I often do. I started tabbing around, checking for the focus indicator, testing interactions with the keyboard, etc. And soon after I started this reactive exercise, I said to myself, what are you doing? You don't need to do this. You were on the project and made sure things were good from day one. So it was just an instinct to start testing something after a product launch. And then the next realization came to me. The fact that we'd shipped a highly accessible product that was well tested all before launch. So I had to take a minute to really appreciate that moment. All of those accessibility axioms and baking analogies of forcing the blueberries into the muffin after the fact. We'd been successful in making sure the blueberries were, in fact, in the batter before baking. Now, of course, there's more work to be done. There's still open issues in GitHub, but the fact remains that we were successful in shifting accessibility left, and it felt really good. I'm so proud of this team and the work that we accomplished together. We shipped 9 themes in total, all to help our merchants provide a highly accessible and usable commerce experience for their customers with disabilities. So I hope these tips help you and your organization shift accessibility left. While this is a new way for us to work at Shopify, maybe it's not new for you or where you're at. How does this compare to how things work on your team? Do you see any areas of improvement? I'm sure there are lots. So please reach out to me on Twitter at @svinkel or leave a question here in the chat. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. That was great. I hope I actually unmuted myself. I enjoyed that very much. I think we have some questions queued up. Lee, do we have a few?
We do. We certainly do. Thanks so
Nice.
much for that talk, Scott. And Susan actually has a couple of questions that I think are kind of relevant to all of us. And there's a bit of a debate that I inadvertently started regarding Fable. And you mentioned that you use Fable, and I understand that they do a lot of recruiting as part of that platform access. But when you need to recruit users who aren't necessarily available through a platform like that, or users who maybe don't fall within their purview of the recruits, do you have any suggestions as to how you recruit for users with who use assistive technologies?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, in the past, we've used other similar platforms, Nobility being one. And I know years past, we used to host sessions in-house. So someone would actually come in and go through a process, and folks would, take notes, or at least watch. But honestly, I don't have a good answer about how to go about that outside of Fable. It's just sort of like our process to reach over to Fable, say, hey, this is what we need, let's set this up. It's really quick turnaround time, which is great. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that.
Well, let's talk about another aspect of the testing that you do. You mentioned in your process, as part of the workflow, usability testing is a priority for you. It's one of the lenses you use to kind of augment the automated testing.
Yeah.
Are there steps in the workflow where that's happening multiple times, or multiple stages of product development where that's happening, or do you have that one touch point?
For sure. In this workflow, it definitely happened during the code review process. So, the PR would be created, and I would pull down the branch, and I would run through that using all the assistive technologies that I have available to myself. And then, like I said, if I went through usability testing, I would update the spec, and then I'd run through it again, and then that's basically it for that flow. But outside of this workflow, for teams that don't necessarily have a specialist on their team, such as myself, it's sort of a little bit more ad hoc. Some teams that are aware of accessibility reach out to me or someone else on the team and sort of get a review quickly on the spot type of thing. Usually it's like right before they ship, which is not great. Other times, part of what I do is I host office hour sessions, and folks will reach out to me with where they're at currently in their development process. We'll talk about where things are at. I'll give them guidance and tips on how to address a specific workflow. But yeah, it's something that we're still figuring out how to do. Like, again, this is very, yeah.
I think there's an interesting question there, because you've kind of very explicitly inserted yourself as accessibility specialist into the workflow between designers and devs.
Yeah.
But as you said, even within Shopify, not all the teams necessarily have that luxury of having someone like you embedded in the team.
Yeah.
But you talked about best practices at the design level and accessibility specifications at the developer level. So that's the kind of model that maybe can be facilitated and become the responsibility of the designers and developers to continue.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the things I've been thinking about more of is the idea of backing away from product space and essentially teaching folks on teams how to do this, how to annotate their own designs, what to look for in code. Something that I have in mind coming up is taking some time away from product and creating some internal training sessions for folks. But I think that's super important. I think it's super key. And yeah, I'm essentially one person. Well, there's two of us now. We have two specialists in-house, but it's not really enough. Part of why I wanted to really share this was the idea that we need to hire more. I'm being selfish here, and we need to hire a lot more specialists because we have a lot of things happening.
Yeah, and that idea of training, I think we're talking very tactically of, okay, let's get this process working within other groups. But you also mentioned the idea of how important it was for a team to understand the problem, why it exists, in order to start to build some interest and engagement and practice.
Yeah.
Are there specific ways that you've been able to describe the problem to product managers or designers or developers to help get them on board?
I think pretty much two ways I can think of off the top of my mind. One would be, going through the motions of doing a full manual audit, and I'd write a lot of tickets, and those tickets would be fairly detailed and explaining why the issue is an issue, who it affects, why, sort of thing, and provide more documentation. I would cite WCAG specifically as backing points, etc. So in that manner, folks will be able to take this information and hopefully learn from it. And then the other thing was, usability testing is great because you typically would get like a video of someone using your product. And if there's any like friction points, you could clearly point that out to product teams, product leadership, say, hey, this person's really struggling to use our thing. This is a big problem. We need to address this. Hopefully they'd watch the session, watch the video and say, oh, I didn't think about someone using this assistive technology would interact with our thing this way. I need to address this. So it's a really great learning opportunity to showcase and to share knowledge, I think.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think we've reached the end of our question barrage.
Cool.
So if maybe Scott, if you have any suggestions on how someone who's in one of those roles can kind of get started, are there any resources? You mentioned the Indeed, I think Figma plugin for the checklist. Any other resources like that you think are a good starting point that doesn't require coaching from a specialist like yourself?
ID24 conference. It's a great place to start. There's so much, there's so much material out there these days. Written material, blogs, as well as video, conferences. It's a common question that I get, and typically one of the starting points I like to share is the W3C WAI group has these perspective videos that really introduce the topic of accessibility, why it's important, at a very high level. There's nothing specific necessarily. It basically shows a person trying to use a thing and it's not working for them for some reason. Right? I think it's very simple and straightforward, but it really gets the point across.
Yeah. The story, someone else's story that
Yeah.
is a perspective that you don't share is really powerful to help you recognize that. That's great. Thanks so much, Scott.
I'm going to jump in here because we're down to the last couple of minutes. We do have a question that rolled in off of Twitter. Lee, did you see that?
I didn't. I was looking. This is from Vernon.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for pointing that out. I missed that with the ID thread there. So do you have any ideas, Scott, for including business analysts and product managers in a workflow? How might those roles help?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think it's a matter of potentially gathering this data, like I shared, and sharing it broadly, sharing it with lots of people. Again, the idea of gathering the data and having it color-coded is something tangible you can share with a lot of people. Again, coming back to the idea of usability testing videos, share those as well. And just bringing those folks in and making it a priority. So, one of the things that I'm working on recently is exactly that, working with more data folks, working with more business folks, getting more people on board, sharing context. It's a work in progress, and we'll see where it goes. But small steps results in big impact.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Scott.
All right. This is the part where I step in because we are definitely at time. Hey, everybody, if you like this session, hit that YouTube like button, tap it, click it, shout at it, whatever works. And don't forget, you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to be kept in the loop for our future events. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our supporters Intopia, Fable, Barrier Break, TPGI, UX for the Win, Equal Entry, InfoAxia, Intuit, Law Office of Laney Feingold, Adrian Roselli LLC, and WebAble. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with our next session, and we will see you then.